The United States and Canada/Britain have recently had a good relationship, but over its history, the North American continent has been a little rowdy, so it's good to visit those disputes from east to west, or it's supposed to be oldest to newest. The place called Machias Seal Island has been in dispute since Prince William Alexander. But we have to go back to the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which ended the American Revolution and secured the young nation's independence. Though this treaty is vague, as you will soon learn from the other ones. The treaty said that everything 20 leagues away from America's shores, except for the islands already occupied by the British or American. According to both nations, the treaty gives themselves a right to the island. This further escalated when Prince William Alexander was given New Brunswick. It gave the island to the British in the treaty. The argument continued for many years until the Canadians put a lighthouse on the island, which they made as a claim to sovereignty. But the United States made the argument that lighthouse is used for international purposes, so it's not a real claim. The argument is still made to this day, with both countries still claiming full sovereignty. Now, let's get that out of the way. Let's talk about larger disputes. After the American Revolution, both sides needed a boundary between the U.S. and British border. So in Article 2 of the Treaty of Paris of 1783, at the beginning of the article, the treaty refers to the highlands of the St. Lawrence tributary. But these were huge tributaries, and there were multiple highlands. So in the end, no one knew what the treaty was talking about, and so no one knew what the Quebec-Massachusetts border was. Oh yeah, and Maine was a part of Massachusetts. Originally, a treaty commission was created to figure out where the border was created, but in the end, give it up. The border in the area did not actually matter due to it literally no one being there. This dragged on through the War of 1812, where the British invaded the area as one of their 4 big invasions, the others being New Orleans, Washington/Baltimore, and New York. But after the war, the treaty was still not solved in the Treaty of Ghent, and the people now in the area were ready to see if they were American or Canadian. Will they be chugging Coca-Cola or maple syrup? Finally, they submitted the dispute to the King of the Netherlands. They did come up with a border which the British loved and the Americans hated. In the winter of 1838 to 39, the American settlers noticed that there were a lot of more British troops in the area than usual. This was because Britain had been looking at a road running through the Aroostook Valley. This road would help the New Brunswick-Quebec economies as well as their defenses. In 1838, a great group of men from New Brunswick went into the area. This angered the governor of Maine. Yes, it's now Maine. In order to push out these men, the governor drafted men across the territory and put together a force that pushed out the intruders. After this skirmish, the president, Martin Van Buren, sent out General Winfield Scott, which was great at discovering if this was American or Canadian, or American or Canadian, or American or Canadian, or Mexican or American. So he went to go occupy the county with a force of 50,000 men. The plan was to have a joint occupation of the territory until things could be sorted out. Meanwhile, the governor kept drafting troops. Soon, the small pockets of British troops arrived and both sides began setting up defenses. It came to a point that in 1839, both sides were raiding each other, and lumberjacks were swinging axes at each other, so no one was hurt. Eventually, Scott arrived and met with Daniel Webster. The treaty to come after this, the Webster-Ashbourne Treaty, which we will hear again, put this on the map, which overall gave the road to the British, but not as much as they hoped. For the American settlers who just lost the land, the British gave up $145,000 to both Maine and Massachusetts to spread out to the masses. Also, 10 years before this war, the guy named John Baker established a Republic of Madawaska for some reason on the now Maine New Brunswick border, which about lasted a year. In the Treaty of Paris of 1783, the area around the Quebec-New Hampshire border was disputed. It was disputed due to them disagreeing about what the northwesternmost part of the Connecticut River was, which America said was the Hull Stream, while Britain said it was the fourth Connecticut Lake. This made an overlapping area which the people of Indian Stream and Hull Stream lived in. This was not a problem until the tax collectors came in. Both American and British tax collectors came in and took the town's money. And if you think the American Revolution was bad, soon the towns had enough combined and created the Republic of Indian Stream. The Republic had a constitution, a military, and laws like a regular republic. The best thing was, America basically recognized it. Import duties were added to all of their products. But soon the committees to solve the border gave all to the British, and the Americans decided to invade, and again things looked like they were going to go to war. But then the Americans just invaded, and the inhabitants didn't really care, and it was ratified in the Treaty of Western Ashbourne. In the Treaty of Paris of 1783, for the most western border, the treaty promised that the most northwestern point of the Lake of the Woods then would go in a straight line until it reached the Mississippi River, which is fine until he realized the Mississippi River is all the way over in the southeast. This means that for people who did not have GPS, could not see where the border was. There was tons of dispute between the Lake of the Woods and Lake Superior. The treaty stated its sense through the middle of Long Lake and the water communication between it and Lake of the Woods. To said Lake of the Woods, there were tons of rivers. What water communication? For local governments to interpret? None. Often the border was invisible and militaries built forts into each other's territory. Eventually the border came down to British overall claim and the American overall claim. But this never really made a serious conflict to arise like the others, but it did have to be settled in the Webster-Ashbourne Treaty, which decided this would be the border. The Oregon Territory is special. It attracted everyone from Moscow to Washington. After the expedition of Lewis and Clark, which returned in 1806, Russia, Spain, Native Indians, Great Britain, and the United States all claimed territory in the Oregon Territory. But remember, the Oregon Territory was way bigger. So in 1819, Spain gave up most of its claim. It still owned southern part of it to the United States in the Transcontinental Treaty. But Russia was actually controlling the area in which the U.S. claimed. But after Russia granted full control over its fishing rights to their citizens, it was enough, and the U.S. forced Russia to return to Alaska. But the British would not budge. Surprisingly, both nations had good claims in the region. The U.S. had Lewis and Clark expedition, which discovered most of Oregon, while the British had Captain Cook's expedition into the Columbian River, which was older but much smaller. In 1818, while the Lake of the Woods to the Mississippi River dispute was being taken care of, the 49 parallel was decided to be the border between the Lake of the Woods to the Rocky Mountains. The U.S. said that the line should go beyond the Rockies and all the way through the Pacific, through Point Roberts and through Vancouver Island. This idea was mostly due to the new idea of Manifest Destiny, which said to conquer all the continent. The British mostly agreed to this, except for the Columbian River, which was because of Cook's expedition border after it hits the 49 parallel. Plus, the Hudson's Bay Company was eager to secure the river for the valuable beaver trade in the area. So instead, they agreed to have troops in the area for the next 10 years in a joint military occupation, which after that 10 years was postponed again for another year, and then they forgot about it until 1842. That year, two big things happened. The first was the Ashburn Treaty, that even though was able to get a good border, but it wasn't able to solve anything about the Oregon Territory. The only thing that they could do about the Oregon Territory was say that the joint occupation was still happening. The other thing actually happened in 1841, when the United States government funded an expedition to find a trail to Oregon, giving a certain John C. Fremont $30,000. The next year was Kit Carson, a guy who spoke many native languages, hunted as good as Davy Crockett, and knew the Boone family. They set out to find and map the Oregon Trail. You see, there were tons of poor families that lived in the East, living in crowded cities or not a lot of farmland. And if the U.S. could create a way for them to get to the Oregon Territory, which had tons of farmland, then the U.S. would have full sovereignty over the land. So John C. Fremont went to Oregon, made a trail, and the United States had full regional power forever. The U.S. at a point had a population compared to the British more than 6-1. America by 1846, with the new president, James K. Polk, were ready to head straight into war, and even said that they were going to pull out of the joint occupation to do it. But neither the U.S. and Britain wanted to go to war, mostly because of the Mexican-American War and wanting to keep good trade. But who was going to own Oregon then? After some pushing from the Secretary of State, James Buchanan, a Treaty of Oregon was created, with the 49th parallel going all the way through to the middle of the Georgia Strait, and then went down the channel. Wait, what? By 1846, most of Oregon was settled, but for the Georgia Strait was filled with mystery. The treaty stated that the border would go to the middle of the channel and then go down a strait. Just which strait? There were 3 straits. One that went west of the islands, one that went east of the islands, and one that went straight through the islands. This left a small predicament. The British set up a sheep farm on the biggest one of the islands, San Juan, while the U.S. had 14 settlers who came in after a failed gold rush in British Columbia. One of these farmers, Lyman Coulter, had a potato farm with 3-sided gate. One day, he found a prized British pig in his potato farm. Enraged, Lyman shot the pig on the spot. Lyman was willing to pay the British, but they demanded $100, and that was a huge sum of money. Lyman refused, and the British made plans to arrest him. Meanwhile, a certain General Harney was visiting, and he was enraged by the British plans. So, on the evidence of a petition, he sent Captain Pickett with 64 men to protect the Americans on the island. Then, after some British ships passed for a blockade, he asked for some reinforcements. To his surprise, he was sent all of the troops from the forts of Bellingham and Steilacoom. Overall, his force made up about 1,564 soldiers. The tension soared when the local British governor of Vancouver ordered troops on the island. The captain of the 3 warships said no. Now, President Buchanan was worried and sent General Winfield Scott to solve the situation. Also heading there was Rear Admiral Baines, who led all British naval forces in the Pacific. Eventually, stopped all orders to land troops on the island. By now, Scott had got to the island and arranged a joint occupation of the islands until they could work out the border. Eventually, after a bloody civil war, the case was brought to German Emperor Wilhelm, and first in 1871, they decided that the islands were in fact American. The Alaskan boundaries dispute goes back to when Russia controlled Alaska. During this time, especially in the late 17th century, Russia settled their way across the modern-day Alaskan panhandle. The area was rich in fish, sea otters, whales, and most importantly, fur. In 1825, Russia and Great Britain signed the Treaty of St. Petersburg, which saw all of Russia's claims go down to the 59th parallel. Through the treaty, did not talk about the eastern border a lot. In it, it said that Russia's boundary would be a line of parallel from the land, which he then turns east, and anything 56 kilometers of that line was Russia's. This did not really matter until after the American Civil War, when the Americans bought Alaska for $7.2 million. A few months later, Canada became a confederation away from Britain, except for the king and other stuff that comes with being a dominion. In 1871, British Columbia joined the nation. After this, the two nations talked about the border and funded a few surveys to see what was the exact border, though none of these were successful. It wasn't until the late 1890s did the dispute really come to a head. In the mid-1890s, tons and tons of gold was discovered in the Yukon. This began a gold rush that began in 1897. Because of this, the local governments wanted a direct route to the Pacific Ocean. But the Americans owned that territory, which meant there was a problem. They tried to find a solution in 1898, but failed. Again, they gave the problems to an international commission, which was made up of 3 Americans, 2 Canadians, and 1 Chief Justice of England. Obviously, there was nothing international about this committee. The Americans said that the treaty meant the border was where the Alaskan Panhandle touched the Pacific Ocean, while the Canadians said it was when the islands off the coast, which gave Canada the shore. The Chief Justice, named Alverson, supported the Americans to the Canadians' outrage. The Canadians refused to sign the treaty, but it did take effect. Though the decision was away from most of the Canadian population, tons of anti-British sentiment became the life. This in turn would cause Canada to become more and more independent until gaining full sovereignty, except for the king, over foreign and domestic policy.